it would arouse fury in China and a major response. I mean, remember that one of the reasons why relations cooled off previously with the David Cameron government was because he had had a meeting with the Dalai Lama. China does react to slights as what it sees as its zone of influence.
James Cleverly is the first sort of senior British cabinet minister to go to China in about 5 years. Why is it taken so long, and why is this trip in particular so significant?
Well, it is the first senior British minister to go to China for 5 years. Now, part of that is because of the lockdown over COVID, and there has been a delay in response by the British and to simply get the invitation. There's also been a considerable chill in relationships with China. The British government decided that China couldn't participate with Huawei in the next generation of telephonic communications. It has also decided that China was too involved in the new nuclear power station being built, and there have been confrontations over the question of the treatment of the Uyghurs and Taiwan as well. Liz Truss, you remember, when she was Prime Minister, was very critical of China and has subsequently gone to Taiwan. So there's been a cooling in relations, but I think the truth of the matter is China is simply too big to be ignored. It's one of the world's top 10 economies. One of the message Britain wants to get out is that it's open to Chinese investment in spite of those limits it's put on it. And finally, there's a degree of competition. The President Macron has already been to China since the opening up again. So has the French, so have representatives of Germany, and so have, of course, the American Secretary of State. So Britain, if you like, is catching up with its G7 competitors in terms of trying to reopen slightly warmer relationship with China.
But China is something of a diversive topic for the Tories, actually, isn't it? Why is this?
Well, as I say, China is viewed as being too big to ignore, but there are many people who think that China wants to assert itself around the world in the South China Sea, where it appears to be building islands and military bases. And it has repeatedly said that it wants to solve the Taiwan question by the end of this decade. So China is adopting a much more aggressive posture, the so-called wolf warrior diplomatic posture towards the rest of the world. And I think that there are those people who think rather than try to cozy up to China for commercial reasons, we have to accept that they're going to be competing world blocs. China's going to be in one and we're going to be in another. And of course, diplomatically, we've also seen recently the meeting of the BRICS, of which China is a member, and that appears to be expanding, and it appears to be expanding as an alternative alliance group in the event of the world imposing sanctions, or the rest of the world imposing sanctions on China over a possible invasion of Taiwan.
And you mentioned Taiwan there. Earlier this morning on Times Radio, we had Alicia Kearns on calling for James Cleverly to go to Taiwan as well next. Is that actually a likely move from the British government?
I think it's very unlikely. Of course, Nancy Pelosi, the previous Speaker of the US House of Representatives, she went. As I say, Liz Truss has already gone, but it would arouse fury in China and a major response. I mean, remember that one of the reasons why relations cooled off previously with the David Cameron government was because he had had a meeting with the Dalai Lama. China does react to slights as what it sees as its zone of influence. So I think it's very unlikely that we'll see a senior government representative making that sort of visit, even although Taiwan, of course, strategically is very important as the world's major supplier of high-grade microchips.
And James Cleverly has said that he sort of seeks to influence China, and that he has brought up humanitarian issues and human rights issues with China. But this isn't a humanitarian visit to China, though, is it?
No, in the past, there's been a very clear, I mean, I've been with Gordon Brown in China and with Tony Blair and others, and there's a very clear way in which this is done. The British government says we do have human rights concerns. the Chinese say, noted, but what about your human rights problems? And the matter is put to one side. And of course, Hong Kong has been incredibly sensitive, bearing in mind that China has not honoured the agreement when it took back control of Hong Kong in terms of representing having a two systems policy between China and Hong Kong. They've simply imposed the will of the mainland there. But, you know, the truth of the matter is there's not much that Britain can do about it. So while standing up in principle, in practice, it seems to be accepted that they will agree to disagree on human rights matters. And frankly, that is the position taken up by just about every other Western state. And
UK-China relations have, as you mentioned before, soured quite a bit from the Cameron government. Is this visit by James Cleverly a sign of an improvement in relations between the British government and China?
Well, it's a slight warming. He's accepted an invitation. He's going to see the Vice President and the Foreign Minister, who he has met before. And of course, there's likely to be further meetings at the G20, which is very much a kind of China-dominated alternative in any case to the G7, the meeting of rich nations. So I think it's trying to put relations back onto a more constructive basis. Frankly, if you say to me, what will James Cleverly get out of it? He may get some increased Chinese investment. Very important, incidentally, that China continues to send students to Britain to study at universities and at private schools. And I think there'll be an attempt to make sure that China doesn't switch elsewhere, particularly to the United States in that area. The other thing I think he will probably get out of it is in the realpolitik area of Ukraine, that China did say it had a friendship without limits with Russia, but it's quite clear, A, that Russia is not winning that war, and B, that China is not wholeheartedly supporting President Putin in what he's doing in Ukraine. And I think if there can be a shift in that area, and many people see that China may well be a peace broker when it comes to that, it's not there yet. I think in practical terms, that will be the area, if anywhere, where Britain may strengthen some of its objectives.
And Rishi Sunak had previously talked quite tough on China, especially during leadership debates with Liz Truss. Is there a risk of him being seen by his party or here in the UK as sort of going back on that now?
I think we are seeing Rishi Sunak generally in foreign policy taking a step back. He's decided not to go to the United Nations General Assembly. We know that he was reluctant to commit on some international environmental meetings as well. I think he doesn't see a great deal of political gain in being on the front foot in foreign policy in the way that, for example, Margaret Thatcher and Tony Blair were in the past, in the way that David Cameron attempted. And therefore, he's being quite wary of China, because he knows that were he to go down that route of trying to say that we were a great partner of China, that would see a big backlash within the Conservative Party. I mean, you've got people ranging from Tom Tugendhat, if you like, on the left of the party, all the way to Ian Duncan Smith, with the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the middle, as you say, all highly critical of China, so he can't afford to be too positive.
And like you say, Sunak's likely to meet Xi at the G20 summit, although he's not going to the UN meeting. Do we think there's a level of sort of what they might call rolling the pitch going on here? Are they trying to see what the Chinese relations are like before that meeting between the Prime Minister?
Yeah, I think, look, it's fairly standard if there's going to be a meeting at heads of government level, although, of course, she is also a head of state. There is likely to be a foreign ministers meeting beforehand. I mean, we have seen that before. I think one of the interesting things, actually, is the personage of James Cleverly himself, in as much as he was appointed Foreign Secretary by Liz Truss, perhaps someone who wasn't seen as a necessarily a star player within the Conservative Party, but I think this degree of international prominence which he has, and frankly the fairly well-judged way in which he's treading the tightrope of diplomatic relations, do make him more of a player looking to the future of the Conservative Party and its possible leadership changes, although at this stage one would have to say that he is not sufficiently well known that one would see him as a rival to Rishi Sunak, which may be one reason why Rishi Sunak is quite willing to see him engage in this sort of diplomacy.
Adam Boulton, thank you very much.